Good morning. It's Wednesday, the 9th of September 2020. Welcome to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name's Pete Fairbairn, and the premise of the show very simple. We're going to fire through five of the biggest stories making waves in the world of sport this morning. As always, I'm joined by one of the nation's top sports journalists, and today very privileged to have the sports editor of The Australian, Wally Mason, on the phone. How are you, Wally?
I'm very well, thanks, Pete. Very well.
Fantastic. There's some big stories, so we're going to rip straight into it. Now, first story this morning comes from Peter Bedell in the Courier Mail, and he's got some quotes from Brisbane Broncos chairman Carl Morris, who says that Wayne Bennett would be welcome back at Red Hill. Courier Mail revealing the prospect of a potential third Bennett reign. It's on the table, with Morris saying the board would consider an application for the 70-year-old to return as coaching director of the beleaguered Brisbane Broncos. We know Bennett's contract at the Rabbitohs ends in 12 months' time, with Jason Demetriou, his assistant, to take over as part of a succession plan. Looking increasingly likely that Kevin Walters will get the head coach's job at the Broncos, a first club coaching job for him, and perhaps the experience of Bennett around him as a coaching director could help set that club up to return to more successful times. I want to ask you, Wally, would a Wayne Bennett return to the Broncos be a good move, or does that club and Bennett himself need to move on?
Look, he's the super coach, Pete. I think it's very hard to suggest that it wouldn't be a good idea to get Bennett back there. You know, he just brings success with him, and his association with that club. Wayne Bennett is the Broncos. Really, he knows the place inside out. He's been associated with success there. I think also if Kevin Walters gets the job, as he seems like he probably will. He's coached in the Super League at club level, but he hasn't coached in the NRL. He's had success. He's had some success at Origin level, but I think he probably would benefit from having Bennett looking over his shoulder. And the other benefit that Bennett brings is his relationship with young players. I know he's 70, but he somehow or other seems to have a knack of getting on with young players, getting the best out of them, making sure they're happy, keeping them at the club. And, I think it'd be a good thing.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you there. I think clear delineation of responsibilities and roles would be pretty critical to make sure that there was, only one chief in Kevin Walters, but to have the support of the man who guided him throughout his playing career. And, of course, they've worked together in a coaching capacity in the past when Walters was an assistant at the Broncos. I feel like it's a good move, and whether you're a Wayne Bennett fan or not, his association with that football club is extremely proud, but it didn't end on great terms back in 2018, did it?
No, it got ugly in 2018, very ugly indeed. And it seemed as if Bennett had burnt his bridges completely and utterly at the club. But Carl Morris, according to Peter Bedell's story, Carl Morris says, personalities, we need to put personalities aside. His job is to, think of what's the benefit of the Broncos first and foremost. And that's what he'll be doing. If the board thinks it's a good idea, he'll go with it.
We'll continue to watch that one with interest, something that, only a few weeks ago you would never have imagined would be back on the table. We move from the NRL to the AFL, and in the announcement yesterday from Essendon's Irish footballer Conor McKenna that he's going to retire from the AFL with immediate effect. He's going to return home after battling homesickness for much of this year. He's played 79 matches for Essendon. Clearly has been a very successful convert from the Gaelic football code. However, this year has struggled to have an impact on the field. Clearly, it has looked like his enjoyment of the game has waned, and he has been battling that homesickness for a long time. The other element to this story, of course, is that Conor McKenna hit the spotlight back in June when he had a positive coronavirus test, which put that AFL competition on hold for a couple of days and forced the postponement of his team's match. As part of a bit of a parting shot as he prepares to leave Australia and return home, he's called for the AFL to consider penalties for Melbourne media that report in an inaccurate or unethical way. He believes there should be repercussions and labelled the behaviour of some sections of the football media disgraceful from that coronavirus episode. Here's a quote from McKenna. He says, "The reality is I had a deadly disease, but people were more worried about the AFL being put off than my actual life. They put AFL football before me. No matter who it is, no one should be treated like that. One thing I won't miss about Australia is the majority of the AFL media, I think they're harsh and negative and don't take into consideration how people might deal with it." It's a pretty big parting shot here from Conor McKenna. Wally, do you think it's justified, or has he simply shown an inability to understand scrutiny that comes as part and parcel of being a professional athlete?
And I don't. The environment in Gaelic football in Ireland is not one of my areas of specialisation, I admit. But my understanding is that it's pretty much an amateur code, and there wouldn't be anywhere near the intense media focus that there is in the AFL. And, he's right in a sense that in the AFL media focus in Melbourne is pretty intense. It's, unrelenting. And if you're an AFL player, you're in that focus, particularly if you're a pretty good one in one of those, more popular teams such as Essendon. He found himself, unfortunately, at the centre of a pretty big story. I mean, just after the code had got back on its feet, within a few days, a player tested positive, and which was a massive threat to the competition. It could have been if it was the first of several positive tests, it potentially would have stopped the competition in its tracks. So it was a massive story, and the AFL media, I think, quite justifiably pursued that story. I'm sure, the subtext to that was everybody was very concerned about his health, but certainly the bigger picture story was the threat to the competition, and I don't think anybody did anything unethical. They just made sure every angle in that story was followed, which our readers would expect. Unfortunately, it came at a time when Conor was suffering from homesickness. He hasn't had a great season, as you suggested. He moved from defence into attack to try and revive his enthusiasm for the game. Didn't really work. I think it's all gone a bit pear-shaped for Conor, and it's probably a good thing that he's going home to play for County Tyrone in the Gaelic competition.
Yeah, I think the economic impact and the football impact of whether that competition was going to get shut down turned it into such a massive story, and media absolutely had an obligation to not only report the story but to explore all the different angles and try to uncover something. I mean, that's essentially the role of a journalist, to try and uncover a part of the story that their competitors don't have. The spotlight on AFL footballers in not just in Melbourne, but in Adelaide and in Perth as well is fairly insatiable. It's probably comparable to English football and the Premier League over in the UK would be, to my mind, the best comparison. There is a real kind of thirst to be first, particularly with the advent of social media and journalists wanting to break news via their kind of channels there, often in the instance before they're able to write a story which actually appears on their employer's website. So it's a fascinating story. I think, to McKenna's point, we do need to be conscious of the way in which sport is reported and ensuring that athletes have support around them from a mental health perspective if what's happening in their football or off the field is being reported in a particular way. However, the flip side is that when you sign up to be a professional athlete, you sign up for the attention and the scrutiny that comes with it, and you can't have one without the other. Our third story this morning comes from The Australian, and it comes from Wayne Smith, who's reporting that the two Bledisloe Cup test matches planned for Southeast Queensland in October are likely to actually be switched and played in New Zealand next month. That's to compensate for the likelihood that the Rugby Championship, featuring South Africa, Australia, New Zealand and Argentina, will in fact be moving to Australia as opposed to being played in New Zealand as originally planned. So lots of fluidity to this one, obviously heavily impacted by the lockdown situation we've seen in Auckland and in New Zealand over the last few weeks. and the changing COVID situation over there. I guess the big story within the story here, though, means that under New Zealand government regulations, the first 4 days the Wallabies spend over there would be spent in virtual isolation, locked in their hotel rooms. After that, there's a staged release. Initially, players would only be able to gather in small groups, then into groups of 10, and only towards the end of the quarantine period would they be free to train as a team. Meanwhile, of course, the absolute champion All Blacks would be able to train together every day without restriction. Despite, I guess, separate to where these matches should be played, because we know that's a fluid situation, and separate to the economic repercussions, Wally, is it pretty unfair that the Wallabies may have to quarantine in New Zealand without being able to train while the All Blacks continue to train as a group ahead of those matches?
I think it is pretty unfair. It's pretty, poor old Dave Rennie won't be looking forward to starting his Wallaby coaching career in circumstances where the best, arguably the greatest rugby team ever, will have an absolute advantage over the Wallabies. If the tests were to be played in Australia, as was one of the plans in southeast Queensland, both the teams would be quarantined in southeast Queensland resorts, where they would, as is pretty common now in the current circumstances, teams are quarantined in an area where they're able to train. So they're kept to themselves, but they can still train, and they can still be in groups large enough to have opposed sessions. But if it's in New Zealand, very strict limits on training and the number of people who can be involved. I think one of the most remarkable things about this whole situation is that a matter of weeks out from when the Bledisloe Cup, we don't know where and when the matches are going to be played.
Yeah, it's fairly remarkable. We saw in the NRL this year, when that competition was restarting, teams weren't allowed to train as a group until all teams were able to do so. So I think in that instance, it was until the Warriors were able to enter the country and set up their temporary base in Tamworth. I would have thought that a gentleman's agreement of sorts, if one team's not able to train for that period of time, the right thing to do would be for New Zealand Rugby to say, okay, the All Blacks, you guys can't train in groups bigger than 3 or 4 as well. Let's keep this on a level playing field. It's not going to be beneficial for either country really, or for either code, for the code at all, if we see one-sided matches which are heavily shaped by the build-up and the preparation. And I just don't think that does anyone any favours. To your point around the fact that we don't know where and when these matches are going to be played, I believe, according to Wayne Smith's article, we should have a clearer indication by the end of the week. Gee, you'd like to think so, because for those of us who are considering our plans in Queensland in the second and third weeks of October, and whether we're going to be attending AFL finals or what it is we want to be doing in that time, you'd like to have the opportunity to make a decision based on whether the Bledisloe Cup's going to be here or not.
Yeah.
Penultimate story today. Sorry, Wally, you were saying?
I think Jacinda Ardern needs to cut him some slack as the best option. I mean, all of these players, they've all been in playing Super Rugby. They've been in bubbles. They haven't been. There's no chance any of them have been exposed to the virus. She should cut them some slack. Let them train while they're in quarantine in large enough groups to make it fair dinkum.
Yeah, well said. Let the boys play. The penultimate story today comes from the Australian as well, from Courtney Walsh. Of course, your tennis aficionado there. He has written that Ash Barty has pulled out of the upcoming French Open, citing COVID fears. We know, of course, she chose not to play in the US Open. France recorded more than 7,000 new cases of coronavirus on Monday. She's determined to protect her health and also the health of her team and her family during the pandemic, so won't defend her singles title from 2019. Her coach, Craig Tyser, endured a health scare during 2019 Australian Open, which left him bedridden. She doesn't want to put him in that situation. And although she's been able to practice, it hasn't been under the supervision of Tyser, who's been unable to gain an exemption to travel to Queensland from Melbourne. Ash Barty missing a second Grand Slam. I think her reasons for doing so are admirable, and there's no issues there. But from a purely sporting perspective, Is there a possibility that she will lose ground on her rivals by missing yet another slam?
Oh, clearly, I think she will. She won't lose any points in the rankings because that's all been put on hold in this slightly bizarre circumstances. But yeah, I mean, tennis is like any other sport. If you don't, if you're playing at the highest level, and if you're not competing regularly at the highest level, you find yourself with all sorts of problems keeping in touch. I mean, she will train hard, no doubt. She's a notoriously hard trainer, and she'll work right through the summer here, and hopefully, fingers crossed, the Australian Open goes ahead, and she'll be there in good condition. But having missed out on so much playing time, it's a big problem for her.
Obviously, she did have that period away from the game when she left to pursue cricket. One might hope that some learnings and things that she took from that time, which helped her to develop her game away from the tour, or to at least maintain her game, can be applied in this instance. We know that Serena Williams is no certainty to play in France. She's unhappy at the prospect of having to stay in the hotel bubble environment there, as opposed to at the US Open, where players have had the option of securing private accommodation if they would prefer. Plenty more to play out there, and plenty more to play out in the US Open over the next couple of days as well. Looking forward to Alex de Minaur's quarterfinal against Dominic Thiem tomorrow. Our final story today comes from Joe Barton in the Daily Telegraph. He talks about the $20 million worth of talent exiting the A-League, I should say, and how that raises the red flags ahead of the new season. There's likely to be a reduced salary cap, or almost certainly for that competition, but at the moment there hasn't been able to be an agreement found between the PFA, the Players Association, and the A-League clubs over what that salary cap looks like, over what the new collective bargaining agreement looks like. We've seen reported this week that some clubs would like to choose which players are asked to take a salary cut, as opposed to a blanket cut across the entire squad as well, which is an approach I wouldn't imagine the Players Association would be all that keen on. We've got great fears for the future of the A-League and its relevance here in Australia. And the longer that we go on without this agreement, the more players who are out of contract are choosing to look elsewhere to secure their futures, and rightly so. How critical is it that they reach an agreement as soon as possible to get these players locked in, Wally?
I think it's absolutely critical. I think the A-League is facing all sorts of problems, really. They haven't got, their broadcast deal runs out in July next year, and we're not seeing a lot of enthusiasm for a new deal. And it looks like the salary cap will come down. Salary cap's currently 3.1. I think it will probably come down to 2.1. Or at least that's what the FFA would like to do. But at the moment, they're losing, as Joe Barton has said, they're losing $20 million worth of talent. Mitch Duke from the Western Sydney Wanderers, one of the biggest stars. The A-League hasn't exactly been replete with superstars in the last couple of years, been one of its biggest problems, the absence of genuine marquee players. And they're starting to lose now the Mitch Duke level sort of stars. There's a chance that Diego Castro at Perth will go. Adam Lafondre at Sydney FC there are rumours that he's on the way out. Riley McGree at Adelaide. And we're hearing nothing of other players coming, new signings. So I think that unless they sort something out relatively quickly, and stem that flow of star players leaving, then I think the A-League might be really struggling.
Yeah, and of course that comes on the back of a second new team in 2 years entering the competition as well, right when player depth really needs to be at its highest. Wally, we've run out of time there, so we're going to have to leave it there. It's been fantastic to have you back on the show this morning and to get your insights and analysis on some of the key stories making waves in Aussie sport. Thanks so much for being on the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff.
Good to talk to you.
Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. Have a great day. Bye.